Well, I think I should thank KuppingerCole for the opportunity to participate. It's an extremely important topic, and it's a timely topic. And to answer your question, I think I have to step back a little bit from the cybersecurity law at the ground level and just speak a little bit about how national security has changed, because we are fundamentally in a new era. We have exited the 9/11 era of the war on terror, and nations and companies have woken up to the real fact that we have traditional threats. We have nation state threats. And in fact, they had always been there. It's just that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11, we took our entire national security apparatus, all of our cybersecurity apparatus, and we trained it on terrorists, forgetting that Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and those national state actors were in fact ramping up their efforts to penetrate our systems right when we were taking our eye off of them. So we are in a fundamentally new era, and I think it's good that C-suites, CSOs, and boards have woken up to this threat. Now, you've asked me specifically about the cybersecurity threat from China. And again, I think it's important. You have to understand some foundational principles to answer that question. The most important principle being that China today doesn't have a government per se in the way that you and I, as a German citizen or American citizen, would understand it. It has a communist party. The party is the entire point of the entire country. The point of the party is not to increase and improve the livelihoods of the people. It is to protect, defend, preserve, and expand the party's power. The second point of the party is to preserve the territorial integrity of China. And the third point is to expand its power abroad. Anyone who does business in China, and no matter what function you serve, whether you're a CSO, a CEO, you're on a board, whatever it is, you have to understand that foundational principle before anything else. They don't have a government, they have a party, and the party rules everything. The party is the whole point of the country. And that means that every quote unquote law is derived from that, because politics and the preservation of the party trump everything else. It's not about growth. It's not about data protection or cooperation with others. It's about protecting the party and protecting their power. Now, in cybersecurity terms, what does that mean? And I'll just say a couple more things and then I'll stop talking. I'm probably talking too much. But China has a very important law in place called civil-military fusion. And we talked about that when we were in office and I was working with the Secretary of State, trying to educate companies about what this law meant for cybersecurity. And it's very simple. Essentially what it is that the party itself has the legal right to take any data that it wants from any company operating in China, domestic or foreign, at any time. And the reason that the party put this rule into place is because the goal is to build the world's preeminent military in a matter of decades. And the idea is to use the know-how and the expertise and the trade practices and the intellectual property of companies operating in China, be they domestic or foreign. In the meantime, they will restrict the abilities of companies to gather data internally, and they are increasing through the cybersecurity laws and other laws their ability to plunder your systems. So how do the cybersecurity laws impact how companies operate? It's not just the cybersecurity laws, it's the cybersecurity laws in this system that is really meant to pull as much out of companies as possible to, again, to protect, defend, expand the party's power. I hope that answers your question. Again, I think it's important to understand the broader framework because you have to understand the broader framework to answer that question appropriately. For 40 years, the United States and other Western countries operated in China under the very generous assumption that by engaging economically, we could change the nature of this Marxist-Leninist regime. And we did so in very good faith. Political parties of all persuasions encouraged corporate leaders to make those very significant investments of their time, their capital, and their know-how to help pull China into the global trading system. And countries like Germany and the United States became intricately linked to what is essentially an adversary. One of the things that we suffer from in the West is something I call strategic narcissism, where we look at only what we want and what we do, and we don't look at what China is doing and saying. And that led us to very wrong conclusions. So what has happened? Essentially, what we did under the Trump administration that I worked for, I should disclose that, is we stepped back and we said, are these measures generating the kind of improvements in behavior and intent from Beijing that we thought we were going to get? And what we found was the answer was no, that they weren't respecting intellectual property rights, that they were infiltrating our countries to a degree that would really shock, I think, a lot of your viewers. The FBI chief here has said publicly many times that he opens up an investigation, a Chinese counterintelligence investigation, every 10 hours. We have investigations in all 50 states. It's a very serious effort to penetrate us. We saw them undermining international institutions. I mean, it's a very long list, but the most important thing to understand is to look at what they're doing, not just in those areas, but really primarily on the military side and the cybersecurity side, which is what we're talking about. You look at three things. What are they building? How have they used it? And how do they intend to use it? They have a 1 million-man army, the world's largest navy, the third largest air force, biochemical weapons programs, 400 nukes, more ICBM launchers than we have. As I said, an intense counter influence in propaganda campaigns. They attack our satellites every day. They practice cutting cables underground. So when you look at that, it's very clear that they're building a military for a global intent, right? It's not just to protect the territory. As they've built it, number two, they've become more aggressive against their people and their neighbors. And then number three, when you listen to what General Secretary Xi Jinping says, he says, I intend to retake Taiwan. I intend to dominate the world. He's very clear about that. This is a very, very ominous thing. So, you mentioned Biden's semiconductor order. Those restrictions started before him in a Republican administration, and they've been continued in the Democrat administration. Why? Not because we want to punish China. We're reacting to China's behavior. That's the key. If the first foundational principle was to understand that the party is the most important thing in China, it's the whole point, is to uphold the power of just a few individuals. The second point to understand is that the West is not punishing China. We're reacting to its behavior. So I would anticipate that this semiconductor order, this is just the beginning, because China has shown no evidence of changing their behavior in 40 plus years. Not just Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, Deng Xiaoping, everybody before him had the same goals. We just weren't paying attention. So the semiconductor order, it's full of loopholes. Wall Street lobbied very hard to get LPs, mutual funds, private equity funds, and others to have carve-outs, and they likely will do that. So it won't work. And at some point, because there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States that China is an adversary, particularly on Capitol Hill in our Congress, those things are going to get tightened. And we're going to realize, again, that it's not just semiconductors, AI, and quantum computing, that it's things like drone technology, mapping technology, right? There are many areas, civilian areas, tech areas, that can be used for military purposes. So I applaud what the president did. I don't think it goes far enough. But it is notable and important for German companies to understand that this is not a political thing. It's not a partisan issue. There's broad agreement in the United States, and it's a reaction to China's behavior. It's not something that's punitive. which means that this is here to stay, and this is a reality that German companies need to reckon with. Well, let's be clear. There aren't a lot of companies that want to expand in China. Volkswagen is an outlier. And companies don't want to expand in China because they're starting to perceive that the risk profile is increasing, not decreasing. And that trajectory isn't changing because of Chinese behavior, right? So it's not just the fact that there's no property rights, no rule of law. It's a vastly corrupt place to do business. But you're seeing under the Xi regime, a party that is reasserting and expanding its intrusions into quote unquote private companies. So therefore, if you're in a rare company that's trying to expand in China right now, what you're doing is you're saying, I'm just going to give up my intellectual property. I am accepting that I'm taking not just a business operational risk there, I'm taking on a reputational risk, doing business in a country that's committing genocide. I'm taking on a physical risk to my people because we've seen numerous examples, and we had this when I was at the State Department, where we would have dual citizens, Chinese Americans, who were prevented from leaving the country. If you're in a business that's expanding in that environment, I would say you got to be thinking about a lot more than just your cybersecurity risks. You're thinking about reputational, business, legal, and physical risks. That's a lot of risks. I'm not saying don't do it. I never want to tell companies what to do, but I think it's important that if you're making these kinds of decisions that you reckon with what is really a kind of a business environment that you would never tolerate were you doing business in, say, Belgium or Argentina. So why would you tolerate those risks in China, but you would never tolerate them in other jurisdictions? That's the China exception that I think companies are waking up and they're saying, that's crazy. We would never accept this in our normal course of business. Why would we accept it there? Well, again, there are different kinds. I mean, I advise all manner of Stephen's clients. So we are a private, family-owned, full-service financial services firm. We're based in Little Rock, Arkansas. We've been around for 90 years, and our business is based on our reputation, our ethics, and decades-long relationships. So we're kind of an old-school place to do business. What I tell investors who are thinking, well, look, I can just go invest in Hong Kong on that stock market. Maybe I see upside for 6 months or a year, and then I'm out again. That's one kind of investment, quote unquote, in China. It's an entirely different thing to say, I have a button manufacturing facility in Shenzhen, and you know what? I can't make those buttons profitably anywhere else that I know of, right? Or, hey, I'm Apple. I've invested, tens of billions of dollars into this market, and I'm going to be there until I'm told to leave, right? Those are three very different scenarios, right? Kind of hot money, a low-end manufacturer, and high-end manufacturing. And so the advice that you give, the conversations that I have are very different with those investors. They all face very similar risks, but I think it's notable that even the Apples of the world are saying, I need to start diversifying my supply chain out because I'm not seeing the behavior change here on the side of the party. And so if even Apple is willing to take that sunk capital and abandon some of it, that tells you something. Now, is it hard to diversify out of China? Absolutely it is. It's costly. It's risky. You might not have relationships in places like Mexico, et cetera. And could you stay there? Yeah, you could. Governments have not set clear red lines for business. And that has put CEOs, chief strategy officers, security officers, really in a difficult place because they're being asked policy questions that really shouldn't be asked of them. Why is that happening? It's happening because we're in this transitional period where we've closed the 9/11 era. We've recognized that China is really not a friend, but governments haven't clearly said, hey, they're an enemy, don't do business there. So the question for companies is, could I see a situation like Russia happen, where there's some sort of conflict and suddenly, oh my God, I got to get out. I got to get out immediately. So what I tell, not the hot money guys, but the low end and the high end manufacturing businesses is, yeah, you need to start thinking about this fringe scenario and ask yourself, what would happen to me if I encountered a Russia? What's the kind of capital loss I would suffer? Have I really protected my intellectual property there in China and elsewhere in the world? Really? You need to start that kind of contingency planning. And you know what? Many companies have already started to do that. But I won't pretend that it's an easy decision. There's also a lot of emotion attached to it. You have companies who've been in China for decades, encouraged to be there by their governments, and they have an attachment to their Chinese employees. We love the Chinese people. America's had a long association, fruitful and warm, with the Chinese people for hundreds of years. So it's not an easy decision. It's going to be specific to every company, how they handle it, because their risk tolerance and their timelines are going to be different. But it's a conversation that you have to start having.